The simulator started eating itself at the 41st second of the run, and the whole academy was watching it happen on the open wire. Telek soon saw the first wrong number before he heard the alarm. He stood on the observation shelf of the Hall of Wakes with the 7 flyers of first section ranked behind him, keels half spread the way Uruvith stood when they were reading each other instead of talking, and he watched the human score begin to fall on the ladder wall like something dropped down a shaft. Sim Bay 9. Challenge Run. Seat 11 of 9th section, candidate A. Roan, species human. The only human in Sarad Combe Academy, flying her one chartered challenge in front of 4,000 cadets who had nothing better to do at third bell than watch a foreigner fail in public. The wall did not show mercy. The wall showed everything. That was the point of the open wire. Every drill, every board, every ascent scored live, posted live, so that no flyer in the academy could ever claim the ladder lied. The number beside Roan A went from a respectable 61 to 44 in 2 heartbeats. Then 31. Then the harmonics graph under it turned the color of a wound. Coupler fault, said Renovasi at Telek's shoulder. His second had the best eyes in first section and the worst habit of narrating. Bay 9's sync drive is shaking apart. Look at the spine trace. Telek was already looking. The simulated lattice, 8 projected wingmates flying the cum figure around the candidate, had begun to wobble in a way no instructor had programmed. The Bay's motion cradle was feeding her real shudder, real tumble, the projection stuttering between frames. A malfunction, not a test. The proctors knew it too. He could see 2 of them on the floor below waving at the Baymaster, and the abort glyph went up on the wall in tall amber letters, visible to the entire academy. Run void candidate, release and exit. Any cadet on Sarad knew what you did with that glyph. You let go. You put your hands flat on the rails, the cradle locked, the bay opened, and you walked out with a voided run and your dignity intact, because a voided run was nobody's fault. The human did not let go. Telek felt the shelf around him go very still. On the ladder wall in front of 4,000 cadets, the score kept falling, 19-12, 8 because the scoring engine had no category for what it was watching, and graded the chaos as error, all of it, every jolt of a machine in the middle of dying. And inside that machine, on the cockpit feed blown up 3 stories tall, a young human woman with her dark hair tied back and a strip of frayed red cloth knotted to her control yoke was flying the failure. Not fighting it, flying it. He saw her drop the simulated lattice without ceremony, shed the cum figure, and turn the tumbling cradle's own violence into a long descending spiral that no page of the cannon contained. Every time the sync drive bucked, she was somehow already leaning into the place where it bucked toward. The motion cradle was rated to throw a flyer into the restraint webbing hard, enough to bruise bone, and she rode it the way Telek had seen tidebirds ride the sheer winds off the comm. Loose at the shoulders, hands quiet, eyes moving. She'll snap the cradle arm, Ren said. She is using the cradle arm, Telek said, and disliked how that sounded, so he added badly. The score hit 0. The wall, having nothing lower to show, did something Telek had never seen in 6 years at the academy. It showed a negative number. A murmur went down the observation shelf like wind through grass, and somewhere below them a cluster of third section cadets started laughing. And the laughter spread the way laughter does in a building with 4,000 young people in it, and one foreigner failing enormously, historically, in front of all of them. -14, -22. The human put the dying simulator into its final spiral, bled the cradle's energy across 6 full turns, and brought the whole shrieking assembly to rest in a position that the Bay's own engineers would later admit was the only attitude from which the cradle arm would not have sheared its mounting bolts and gone through the bay wall. Then the feed showed her sit back, unhook her restraints with steady hands, touch the red ribbon on the yoke once, quick, like checking a latch, and climb out of a machine that was still ticking and smoking into a hall of laughter. The ladder wall posted her final score to the entire academy, Rone. Challenge run, -31, the lowest number ever displayed on the open wire in the 100 years the academy had kept one. Well, said Ren, that's settled then. That should have been settled then. Telek turned from the rail with his section turning behind him, 1 body, 8 flyers in the gray and bone flight skins of first, and he would have left the Hall of Wakes without another thought if the speakers had not crackled with the Baymaster's voice asking the candidate, with the wire still open, whether she required medical assessment, and the human's voice had not come back flat and unhurried, audible to every cadet in the building. No, I require the last 40 seconds of telemetry from that machine. Something's wrong with your couplers. The laughter doubled. Telek did not laugh. Uruvith showed amusement with the keel, a soft ripple along the body's lateral lines, and his keel did not ripple. The arrogance of it pinned him in place for a moment, a flyer with a -31 on the wall, diagnosing the academy's hardware on her way out of the wreck she'd just made. Discipline, answered Noise. That was the first sentence of the first page of the canon. Noise did not get to explain itself. He filed her under Noise, and he went to morning circuit with his section, and by the fourth bell he had almost stopped thinking about the loose, leaning way she had sat inside a collapsing machine, as if it were a weather system instead of an emergency. By the sixth bell, the Academy summoned him to testify at her assessment, and that is where the term truly began. The assessment chamber sat at the top of the spine stair, a round room of pale stone and cold light where the wing provost heard every dispute the latter produced. Telek had stood witness there 4 times in his cadet years. Section leaders were the Academy's preferred eyes. He took the witness ring at the chamber's edge with 2 proctors, the Bay engineer and Flight Master Orvin Day, who ran the flight curriculum and whose crest had gone the dull silver of late age and looked this morning like a blade someone intended to use. The human stood in the center on the speaker's disc. Up close she was smaller than the wall had made her, a compact woman in an unmarked cadet skin with weather lines already at the corners of her eyes, too young to have earned them slowly. The red ribbon was knotted around her left wrist now. She stood the way she'd flown, loose, balanced, unbothered, and Telek found the steadiness vaguely offensive. The chamber was built to be felt. She did not appear to be feeling it. Wing Provost Selathandra read the matter aloud for the record. Candidate Asheron, transfer admission under the Outworld Compact, former atmospheric courier Earth. Challenge run terminated in equipment casualty. Score posted, -31. Petition of Flight Master Day, that the candidate's flight privileges be revoked in full, the score standing as evidence of unfitness for lattice instruction. The machine failed, the human said when the disc was given to her. Not loudly. Your sync couplers have a harmonic skip in them. It's in the last 40 seconds of telemetry if anyone pulls it. I'd start there. The Bay engineer pulled it, projected it, and walked the chamber through every line, and Telek listened with his keel spread because numbers had a texture and he wanted to feel this set. The engineer's conclusion was delivered with the satisfaction of a man defending his own bolts. The couplers showed stress consistent with violent control inputs. Cause and casualty ran the other way. The candidate's hands had broken the machine. The machine had not broken her run. The skip she described appeared nowhere the diagnostic suite knew how to look. Section leader soon, the provost said, you observed the run in full. You're reading. He gave it honestly, which he would remember later the way one remembers a debt. He said the candidate had abandoned the assigned figure at the first fault instead of holding form and trusting the proctors. He said her recovery had been improvised, violent, illegible, that no flyer could have followed her through it, and a lattice flyer who cannot be followed is not a flyer but a hazard with a license. He said the Academy's machines had flown 900 cadet runs that term without complaint until this one, and that when one instrument disagrees with 900, you do not recalibrate the 900. He believed every word of it. The chamber's lights were cold, and the stone was old, and he stood in the witness ring of the institution that had rebuilt him from a shorn fledgling into the leader of first section, and he believed every word. The human watched him say it. She did not glare. She looked at him the way she had looked at the dying simulator, attentively, as if he were a system producing data, and when he finished, she asked the provost for leave to put one question to the witness, and the provost, curious, allowed it. When your section flies the braid, Asheron said, and the wind through the sheer gusts crosswise mid-figure, what do? The lattice holds form, Telek said. We damp the gust through the shoal and fly the page as written. And if the page is wrong about the wind, the page is not wrong about the wind. The page was written in the wind. 1,100 flyers wrote it over 100 years. All of them flying machines that worked, she said, and turned back to the provost before he could answer, which was its own kind of answer, and the chamber murmured, and Flight Master D's crest flattened with contempt. The ruling came down within the hour, because the latter's charter was older than anyone's opinion, and the charter was explicit. A challenge ending in equipment casualty, cause disputed, could not void flight privileges outright. The score stood, the candidate stood, and a standing candidate with the Academy's lowest posted score went where the latter put her. To the bottom. 12th section, the bilge of the wing. The 7 flyers no other section leader would feed. In the cold hangar at the foot of the cliff, where the wind off the Shishir came in under the doors, and the ladder wall's repeater screen had been broken for 2 terms because nobody in 12th wanted to see the numbers anyway. The ladder is generous, D said to the chamber, in the tone of a man putting something on the record for later. It gives even Noise a rung to hold. It also keeps score. He looked at the human as the proctors closed the session. Every ascent, every board, every circuit you fly will post to the open wire candidate. The Academy will see all of it. I suggest you give it less to laugh at. She tightened the ribbon at her wrist, one small tug, and said, they can watch. It would have ended there, should have ended there. A foreigner filed at the bottom of the ladder to fade quietly out of everyone's morning. Except that cadets talk, and the corridor outside the chamber was full of them, and somebody called out asking section leader soon, loud enough to carry, whether first would ever take a human into lattice. And Telek, with the testimony still warm in his mouth and his section waiting and the whole stupid day pressing on him, gave the corridor the sentence the academy would spend a term feeding back to him one spoonful at a time. Humans cannot hold lattice, he said. They fly alone. It is not an insult, it is anatomy. You may as well roster a stone in a shoal, the corridor approved. The wire carried it. By evening mess, it was written on a banner some fourth section wit had hung in the refectory. Humans fly alone. With a little drawing of a stone with wings, and the academy laughed, and the human walked under the banner to collect her tray and did not look up at it. And Telek watched her not look up at it and felt, for the first time in years, the small, cold draft of a thing said publicly that might need to be true now, whether or not it was. He went back to his quarters after final bell and did not sleep on the perch. Aruvith slept badly when the shoal was unsettled, and his shoal was not unsettled. First section's 8 keels had hummed agreement with every word he'd said all day. The unsettled thing was singular, and behind his own ribs, and it had a shape, 40 seconds of telemetry. He told himself he was reviewing the file as a section leader, because first flew the same sync couplers as Bay 9, in real hulls, over a canyon that did not have a motion cradle's mercy. He pulled the casualty record to his slate in the dark. He read it the way the engineer had read it, and it said what the engineer had said: violent inputs, stressed couplers, a candidate flying like a storm given hands. Then he read it the other way. He covered the conclusions and read only the raw trace, the way his first instructor had taught him to read wind, no page, no expectation, just the line. And there, 4 times in 40 seconds, he found a thing his keel would never have felt in the air because it was too fast and too small and too alone. A skip, a momentary nothing. The sync drive letting go of its load for 0.03 of a second and catching it again, each time a fraction of a heartbeat before the violence got worse, not after her inputs before them. Before. Each one of her savage, illegible control movements began inside the gap where the machine had already failed. She had not been breaking the machine. She had been catching it, 4 times. Faster than the diagnostic suite sampled, faster than a shoal could vote, faster than anything in the cannon. Telek sat in the dark with the trace glowing on his slate and his keel pulled flat to his sides, and from the cliff below his window he could hear, very faintly over the night wind off the sheer, the sound of someone in the bilge hangar running a thruster bench at an hour when every sane cadet was asleep. A single drive, firing in short disciplined pulses over and over, like a question asked of the dark. He closed the file. He did not file an addendum to his testimony. He was first section's leader. He had 4,000 witnesses to a sentence about stones and shoals, and the academy's lowest ever score was already painted on the wall of the term like a verdict. But he lay awake on the perch a long time, and his last thought before sleep was not a comfortable one for a flyer built of discipline. If the machine failed before she moved, then everything I told the chamber pointed backward, and nobody in that room could see it but her. The wind worked the hangar doors at the foot of the cliff all night in off the sheer, gust and lull, and far below his window the lone thruster answered it pulse for pulse, as if the two of them were already in conversation. 12th section's hangar smelled of cold grease and salt, and the particular mildew of equipment nobody requisitioned anymore. Asha Rowan stood in the middle of it on her first morning as its 8th and lowest ranked flyer, and her new section did not stand to meet her so much as fail to leave. Telek was not there for that. He heard it the way the academy heard everything, through the wire in the refectory and Wren's relentless narration, and the account that reached him went like this. The human had walked the line of 12th's 7 cast-offs, the Aruvith fledgling with the stunted keel who washed out of every shoal he touched, the bracket heavy worlder too massive for tight formation, the Marasi twins who flew beautifully and panicked predictably, the rest of the wing's spare parts, and she had not given a speech. She had asked one question: who here has ever been told what they're good at? And when nobody answered, she had gone to the equipment cage, cut 8 lengths from a roll of old signal cloth, red, and tied one to the yoke of every hull in the hangar. A strip of cloth, on machines with 40 million credits of sensors apiece. Telltales, Wren reported, ripple-keeled with amusement at evening mess, like a sail rig. She told them instruments average and eyes don't. She told them the ribbon shows the wind that's actually there, this instant on your own hull, not the wind the suite agrees on. The brash had asked her what was wrong with the suite. Wren paused for effect. Wren always paused for effect. She said nothing, until the day it lies, and on that day you'll want to already speak ribbon. First section laughed, 8 keels rippling in clean unison. Telek laughed with his body and did not laugh anywhere else, because he had spent 4 nights now with a casualty trace no one else had reread, and the phrase "the day it lies" had landed in him like a hook in old scar. He said nothing. Discipline answered noise. The ladder would grade her soon enough. The first ascent of the term was 9 days out. Every section flying the climb and the comb over the open wire. Scores lived to the whole academy, and 12th section had finished 12th in 11 consecutive ascents, which was the kind of consistency even the canon had to respect. 9 days later, 12th section finished 8th, and the ladder wall hiccuped. It was not a polite 8th. The climb was a brute of a figure. 8 hulls in stacked echelon riding the thermal column off the comm's south face, each flyer holding station in the wake of the one above, the whole lattice winding up 2,000 meters like a screw being driven into the sky. Sections lost points for every meter of drift, every late correction, every wobble the scoring suite could see. 12th had historically flown the climb the way furniture flies, separately and only when thrown. Telek watched the run from the first section ready line with half an eye, because first flew last and his flyers were stretching into their skins, and what pulled his whole eye was the sound the Hall of Wakes made when 12th score stopped falling. The wire had given them the courtesy number every section starts with, and then, as the 8 cast-off hulls came up the thermal in a stack that did not drift, did not wobble, did not shed a single meter, the number simply stayed. The laughter that had been waiting in 4,000 throats had nowhere to go. By the top of the climb, the bilge section of Sarad Comb Academy was posting station-keeping tolerances that 5th section would have framed. "That's not possible," Ren said, narrating again. "The break it alone displaces. Look at him. He's flying half a length wide of the wake seam and correcting before the seam moves." "They're all correcting before. How do they know?" Telek knew how they knew. He had spent 4 nights with 40 seconds of telemetry. He recognized the signature of eyes that watched the wind itself instead of the wind's paperwork. Every hull in that stack flew with its nose telltale streaming. He could see the red threads even at this distance, bright against the cliff, and every flyer in that stack was reading the gust on the ribbon of the hull above them a full breath before the gust arrived at their own. They were not holding formation by feeling each other the way a shoal held. They could not. There was a human in the 5-seat and a stunted keel, fledgling in the 8, and a bracket in the anchor who had never synced with anything in his life. They were holding formation by watching, each flyer reading the one above, passing the wind down the stack eye to eye, like a sentence whispered along a line of children, except the sentence arrived intact. The comm went the same way. 12th flew the crosswind gates of the second figure with a looseness that made the purists on the shelf hiss. Their spacing breathed, expanded and contracted gate by gate, nothing like the rigid intervals the canon prescribed, and the scoring suite, which graded outcomes rather than aesthetics, found nothing to deduct. 8th place. The repeater screen in the bilge hangar was still broken, so 12th section heard their score the old way, shouted down the cliff stairs by a morassy twin who had run all the way from the hall, and the academy above them digested the indigestible. The banner came down from the refectory that night. Nobody admitted taking it. Flightmaster Day convened the section leaders the following morning in the chart room above the spine stair, and his crest was flat before anyone spoke. The ladder posted what the ladder posted, he said, and the ladder was charter. Nobody disputed the number. What concerned the curriculum was method. Reports indicated 12th section had flown both figures with unauthorized equipment fixed to flight surfaces, foreign material, untested, uncertified, capable of fouling a control linkage. The academy had standards for what touched its hulls. Section leader soon would conduct the equipment audit as senior leader, with the authority to strip anything not in the manifest. "Why me?" Telek said, and it was not really a question, and Day's crest told him it had not really been an assignment. It was a leash being handed to the dog the whole academy had already heard bark. Humans cannot hold lattice. The flight master wanted the sentence finished by the same mouth that started it. He went down the cliff stairs to the bilge hangar at 4th bell with 2 proctors and a manifest slate, and the cold came up the stairwell to meet him. And 12th section stood to receive the audit in a line that was straighter than any line 12th section had ever stood in. 8 flyers, 7 species, 1 strip of red cloth on every yoke, every nose, every wingtip. He counted 22 of them, logged each one, and ordered them removed. The human untied them herself. All 22, working down the line of hulls while her section stood at attention, and the proctors watched and wind off the shear came in under the doors. She did not argue the manifest, did not cite the charter, did not perform any of the noise he had braced for. She coiled the ribbons into a neat red bundle, set the bundle in his hand, and said, "They've already done the work, section leader. You're confiscating the scaffolding." "Cloth doesn't teach," he said. "No," she agreed. "It shows." Teaching is what happens after somebody finally sees. She nodded at the stunted keel fledgling, third in the line, a young Aruvith named S. Tovey, whom 3 shoals had returned like defective cargo. He's been told his whole life he can't feel the lattice. Nobody ever told him he could just look at it. The keel averages, section leader. Your whole species flies on a beautiful average. His average is broken, so they threw him away. But his eyes were never broken, and now he's the best gate reader I have. The shoal is not an average, Telek said, with more heat than an audit required. It is 8 flyers feeling 1 wind. It's 8 instruments voting, she said. And a vote is an average with ceremony. When the wind is honest, your way is better than mine. I'd never claim otherwise. I've watched first fly, and it's the cleanest thing on this cliff. But the vote smooths the edges, and someday the edge is the data. She glanced briefly, deliberately, at the slate under his arm where her casualty report had lived for half a term in a queue nobody read. Some days a machine skips faster than 8 keels can pole. Ask your couplers. The proctors were out of earshot, checking the bracket's hull. Telek stood holding a bundle of red cloth that weighed nothing and did not weigh nothing. And for one undisciplined moment he wanted to tell her. I read the trace. I saw the skips. You moved after the machine failed, not before. I testified backward. I have known it for 20 nights. The moment passed the way such moments pass for flyers built like him. It banked, lost speed, and landed nowhere. The ribbons stay off, he said. The manifest is the manifest. Yes, section leader. She came to attention correctly, Earth style, spine straight, and there was no mockery in it, which somehow made it worse. Watch the next ascent anyway. He watched the next ascent. The entire academy watched the next ascent, because by then the bilge section's 8th place had become the only thing the refectory talked about, and the wire gave the second ascent of the term its biggest audience in years. 12th section flew the braid, the hardest of the early figures, 2 interleaved files of 4 exchanging stations through a weave of wake seams, with no ribbons, no telltales, nothing on their hulls but paint and manifest, and they finished 5th. 5th, the hangar at the foot of the cliff with the broken repeater screen, 5th, over the open wire, and this time the sound in the Hall of Wakes was not a hiccup. It was 4,000 cadets recalculating at once. She had told him the truth in the cold hangar. The cloth was scaffolding. He had stripped the scaffolding and found the building finished underneath. 8 cast-offs who had learned to see wind and could not now unlearn it because seeing is not equipment and does not appear on any manifest. The audit had proven her method by failing to remove it, and every section leader on the cliff knew exactly whose hands had run the audit, and Telek stood on the shelf, listening to 12th's 5th-place score post and understood, with the clean dispassion the cannon had spent 6 years installing in him, that he had just been used as a demonstration. What he felt underneath the dispassion took him 3 days to name, because it had been a long time since he had felt it about anything alive. Professional envy, not of the score first had taken the ascent itself, as first always did, their braid a textbook page made flesh. Of the teaching. He led the finest section on Sarad, and he had never taught anyone anything. He had selected them, 8 superb keels, and the shoal had done the rest. She had been handed the wings discards, and had built flyers out of them with cloth and patience and a way of looking, and somewhere in his body, in the place where the shoal feeling lived, an old wound he kept clean and private ached along its scar line. He had been 6 years old when his civic shoal cut him. Fledglings flew the city thermals of Orun Vass in training shoals of 30, keels newly opened, drunk on the feeling every Aruvith waits a childhood for. 30 bodies, 1 wind, the consensus humming down the lateral lines like warm current, and on a gray morning over the harbor, little Telek soon had seen a mooring cable where the shoal felt none, because the light caught it and his eyes were young and sharp, and the consensus said glide and his eyes said cable, and he had broken, banked alone. Screamed the warning with his body in the only grammar Aruvith have, deviation, and the shoal had not followed. Shoals do not follow fledglings, and the cable had taken the lead instructor's wing and 2 children to the harbor. Nets, and every adult agreed afterward that the casualties were the cable's fault and the breaking was Telek's. Because a shoal that cannot trust its own consensus is not a shoal, and a fledgling who trusts his eyes over 30 keels will do it again. Shorn. The word still had a texture, like the day itself. The formal severing, the training shoal closing its lattice against him in the assembly hall, 30 keels going silent to his keel at once. It is a kind of deafness no species without a shoal sense can be made to understand. His family had emigrated to Sarad the next year. He had rebuilt himself page by page out of the canon. If his instincts could not be trusted, he would have no instincts. He would have the figures, the tolerances, the discipline, the perfect average, and the academy had rewarded the rebuild all the way to the lead seat of first section, and he had told the story to no one ever. And on the third night after 12th section flew the braid without ribbons, he dreamed of a red cable. Across a gray sky and woke with his keel flared and aching, and lay in the dark hating, with great precision, a woman who had looked at a broken-keeled fledgling and said his eyes were never broken, because nobody had said it to him. That was all. Nobody had ever once said it to him. The boards came at mid-term, and the boards were where the ladder stopped being a spectator sport. Ascents ranked sections, boards ranked flyers. Any cadet could challenge any seat one rung above their own, file at the morning wire, fly the holder head-to-head through the shears marked circuit at dusk, scored on the open wire, winner seated, loser bumped. Most terms produced a handful of challenges. This term the wire was a ledger of small wars, because a human at the bottom of the ladder had begun to climb it seat by seat, and the academy could not look away. She challenged into 9th and took the seat by 11 points. 2 days of mockery about soft opposition. She challenged into 8th and took the seat by 30, and the mockery thin. She skipped 7th, its flyers arranged with sudden unanimity to have no seat eligible that week, a dodge the charter permitted and the refectory did not respect, and she challenged into 6th against a flyer named Courier who had held his seat 3 terms and trained openly for 10 days to be the one who put the foreigner back down the cliff. Telek watched that circuit from the rail above the sheer with most of the academy. Dusk, the canyon walls going copper, the marked gates strung down the gorge on light pylons, 2 hulls in the start boxes. The sheer at dusk was the reason the academy existed on this cliff. The day wind and the night wind changed shift in the gorge, and for half a bell the canyon breathed in both directions at once, gusts shearing off the rock with no pattern any suite had ever fully mapped. Flying it clean was the curriculum. Flying it fast was the boards. Courier flew it the way 6th section flew everything. Correct, committed, his keel ringing every drop of advantage from gust damping, the cannon's pages turning one by one. He was 2 gates ahead at the halfway pylon, and the refectory's money was on him. Then the shift came through. Telek felt it even on the rail, the canyon's exhale stuttering, and down in the gorge every flag on every pylon snapped through 90 degrees in a breath, and Courier did what the page said, damped, held form, gave away speed for stability, because the page knew the gust would try to put him into the wall. The human did not damp. She had no keel to damp with. She read the shift coming. Later, frame by frame on the replay, the academy would see her head turn toward a curl of dust 2 gates early, see the dark eyes find the canyons tell the way they had once found a skip in 40 seconds of dying telemetry, and she banked into the gust's shoulder and let it throw her through the gate, sideways, sliding on the wind's violence like a door flung open. Hull crab 20 degrees off her track, a flying attitude that appeared in the canon only in the chapter on crashes. The gust that cost Courier 2 lengths handed her 5. She crossed the last gate a hull and a half ahead, and the wire posted the seat change before the dust settled, and 4,000 cadets made a sound that had no laughter left in it at all. 6th section, mid-ladder, a human in the wing's respectable middle, flying a style no instructor taught, with a section of cast-offs behind her flying it too, and a term half spent. That night, the skip came back. It came back in her board telemetry, where only 2 people on the cliff would ever look for it. The candidate, who filed her 3rd equipment report before the dust was off her hull, and the leader of 1st section, who pulled the public trace at midnight as he now pulled every trace she flew, and found it in the data like a familiar handwriting. Gate 14, 0.03 of a second, her starboard coupler letting go and catching, in clean air this time, no violent inputs anywhere near it, the machine skipping for no reason at all, and her hand already moving inside the gap. Her report joined the other 2 in the queue. The engineering annex appended the same finding to all 3. Anomaly not reproducible. Coupler stress consistent with candidate's documented control style. No further action. The phrase documented control style did a great deal of work in that sentence, and the documentation it leaned on was a -31 on the ladder wall and the testimony of section leader Telek Soon. 2 mornings later, in a routine training circuit with no audience and no stakes, the skip found Ren Ovasi. It happened in the carded leg, the gust corridor where the sheer narrowed between 2 rock teeth, and every section drilled crosswind discipline 100 mornings a term. First was flying the corridor in paired files, an exercise so routine Telek could have flown it asleep, and the shoal was humming its warm consensus down his lateral lines. 8 keels, 1 wind, the feeling he had rebuilt his whole life around, when Ren's hull skipped. A third of a heartbeat where his seconds drive simply was not there, and Ren, superb narrating, irreplaceable Ren, fell half a length out of the seam, caught the stumble with both hands and a curse, and powered back into station with the ugliest correction Telek had seen him fly in 4 years. Here is the thing that kept Telek awake afterward. His keel felt nothing. The shoal hummed on. 8 keels pulled the lattice and 7 reported steady, and the consensus rounded Wren's missing third of a heartbeat down to 0, smoothed it, paved it over, exactly the way 30 fledgling keels had once paved over a mooring cable. And if Telek had not been watching with his eyes, watching the way she had infected him into watching, he would have agreed with his own body that nothing had happened at all. Hand slipped, Wren said on the ground, embarrassed, keel tight. Long night. It won't repeat. Pull your trace, Telek said. It was nothing, lead. Pull it. They pulled it in the section room with the door shut, and there it was in Wren's starboard coupler line, the familiar handwriting. A 300th of a second nothing, load shedding and catching, no control input anywhere near it. Telek laid it on the table beside a file he should not have had, the human's 3 dismissed reports. Requisitioned quietly through a records clerk who owed him, and watched his second read all 4 traces twice, and watched Wren's keel flatten slowly against his sides like a sail losing its wind. That's her fault signature, Wren said. From the casualty run. The one he stopped, reorganized the sentence, the one we testified she caused. I testified, Telek said. You watched. Lead. Wren's voice was careful. Our hull took the Aral refit 8 days ago. Bay 9 ran the Aral prototype suite all last term. Hers was the first heavy run on it. He touched the table's edge with one long finger, very precisely, as if pinning the thought down before it could leave. When did 6th section refit? Telek checked. 6th had refit 5 days before her board telemetry caught gate 14 skipping in clean air. He sat in the section room for a long time after Wren left, with 4 traces glowing in front of him, doing the arithmetic the engineering annex had declined to do. The wings' hulls were taking the new Oral sync couplers in rotation, section by section, oldest hardware first, the whole refit timed to finish before the end of term, before the centennial. Every hull on the cliff would be flying Oral couplers by the night the Academy put its 100th year on the open wire. He went looking for the coupler right that evening, down in the refit bays where the wings' hulls hung in their cradles like patients, and found Hav where Hav always was, half inside an engine cowling, swearing at it in the patient way of a being who had been swearing at engines. Since before Telek fledged, Telek was not subtle because he did not know how to be. He laid the 4 traces on the workbench and asked the only question that mattered. Can the Aral coupler drop load under flight conditions in a way the bench can't see? Hav looked at the traces for a long time. Then he wiped his hands, closed the bay door, and said the most informative thing anyone had said all term. You didn't get those from the annex. No. Then I'll tell you what the annex won't write down. Hav pulled a stripped coupler core from the parts rack and turned it under the light. The Aral's a fine instrument. Faster sync, lighter, cheaper to run, everything the procurement folio promised. On the bench it's flawless. I've run 10,000 cycles, it never misses. But the bench holds it still, and a hull doesn't. Put it under full lattice load, then hit it with a sharp lateral, a real gust, the kind the shear makes at shift change, and somewhere in the firmware 2 corrections collide. It lets go. 300ths. Catches itself before any standard suite can sample it. I've believed it for half a term and I can't prove it, because I can't strap a canyon to my bench. She proved it, Telek said. 3 times she documented it, Hav said. Proof is documentation plus somebody willing to read it, and her name is on the documentation, and you of all flyers know what her name is worth in the annex this term. He set the core down. The refits the Flight Master's program, section leader, his signature on the folio, his century on the line, his examiners coming to watch his academy fly his couplers down his canyon. Bring me evidence that isn't human-shaped, and I'll put my name beside it. Until then, I'm one right with a feeling, and feelings don't stop refits. Evidence that isn't human-shaped. Telek carried the phrase up the cliff stairs like something heavy, and the next morning the Academy gave him a deadline for deciding what to do with it. The provost called full assembly in the Hall of Wakes, all 12 sections in ranked blocks, the ladder wall behind her burning with the Academy's crest, and announced the shape of the centennial 100 years of Sarad Kombe Academy. To mark it, the wing would fly the long descent. The full dusk circuit, top of the comm to the canyon floor, through the throat, every gate lit, before a reviewing board of fleet examiners with commissions in their gift. 2 lattices would fly it paired, 16 hulls in one sky, the Academy's oldest and proudest figure. The first lattice, by charter, first section, whole. The second, by centennial tradition, not second section. The riser's 8, a lattice assembled from the term's 8 most successful board climbers, whatever their section, led by the cadet with the most rungs gained. The ladder's own children flying beside the ladder's best, to show the examiners the Academy's floor as well as its ceiling. The wire lit up before the provost finished speaking, because every cadet in the hall could run the arithmetic of the term so far in their heads. The board season had one name on top of it, and everyone knew the name, and the name had brought 5 of her old castoffs up the rungs behind her. The stunted keel fledgling had taken 2 seats himself, the bracket one, the Marassi twins one each, all of them flying ribbons off, eyes out, wind reading that half the lower ladder was now imitating in unsanctioned night drills. If the term ended today, the riser's 8 was Asha Roan and the rebuilt bones of 12th section, and the centennial-long descent, the Academy's 100th year, live on the open wire, in front of the fleet, would be flown by 1st section paired with a lattice of discards led by a human with the lowest score in the history of the wall. Telek stood at the head of his section block and watched Flightmaster Day watch the hall absorb this, and the Flightmaster's crest did not move at all, which in an Aruvith of his age was the loudest thing in the room. The summons came to Telek that same night as he had known it would. These chambers occupied the old watchroom at the top of the academy, where the first instructors had once sat with long glasses and graded their students against the actual wind. The Flightmaster stood at the window with the sheer black below him and the gate pylons strung down it like a dropped necklace, and he did not turn when Telek entered, and he spoke as if resuming a conversation they had been having for years. "I fledged on this cliff 70 years ago," D said. "I have buried 4 wingmates in that canyon. Every page of the canon that keeps these children alive was paid for soon. I signed the oral folio because the old couplers were dying of age and taking margins with them. Whatever else you have heard, hear that first. I haven't spoken of couplers, Flightmaster. You requisitioned 3 dismissed equipment reports through a records clerk. You spent an evening in the refit bays, and your section pulled a private trace review after a training stumble." The old crest turned, finally, and the eyes under it were not stupid, had never been stupid. That was the worst of it. "You are the best lattice lead this academy has produced in 20 years, because you understand the single thing your generation refuses to learn. That discipline is how the dead protect the living. The cannon is 1,100 flyers talking to you from the floor of that canyon. And you are about to set their book down because a courier with a ribbon has found a ghost in my couplers. Ren's trace shows a transient." D crossed to his desk and laid his hand flat on it, and on the desk Telek saw was the engineering annex's full review, already convened, already concluded, dated that afternoon, fast, impossibly fast, review at the speed of preemption. 11 transients across 400 refit flight hours, everyone self-arrested, everyone within certified tolerance. The annex finds the fleet examiners need not be notified. I find the Academy's century will not be spent on superstition. The hand did not move, the voice did not rise. The threat, when it came, was administered like medicine. Your commission goes to the examiner's board with my endorsement attached, section leader. So does everyone's. Walk your section in clean lines for 6 more weeks, and you will leave this cliff with a fleet lattice of your own. Spend those weeks instead carrying a human's paperwork up my stairs, and the endorsement will say what it must about a lead who lost his nerve in his final term and started seeing cables in clean sky. The word went through Telek like a blade going through a sail. Cables. He stood very still and let it pass and understood 3 things in its wake in order, with the clean dispassion that was the only gift the Shorn ever fully keep. 1. The Flightmaster had read his fledgling file. Of course he had. He had read everyone's. 2. The annex review on that desk meant her reports would never be read again by anyone with the authority to act on them. The wall she could not climb had just been built to its full height while he watched. 3. And this one arrived quietly, the way true things do. The man at the window was not lying about the dead or the cannon or the margins. He believed it all. He had simply reached the age where the cost of being wrong had grown larger than the canyon and had chosen, the way institutions choose, to make the data smaller instead. He was the shoal, pulling 8 steady keels, rounding the missing heartbeat down to 0. He was the consensus, and the consensus said glide. Clean lines, Flightmaster, Telek said and saluted and left, and stood on the cold landing of the watchroom stairs for a long moment, listening to the wind work the sheer in the dark. Then he went down the stairs, all of them, past his own level, past the section halls, past the refectory where the wire chattered, down the cliff stairs with the night wind rising up them, to the bilge hangar at the bottom of the academy, where a broken repeater screen hung on the wall and a single thruster bench was firing in short, disciplined pulses, and he walked in on the human and her cast-offs in the middle of an unsanctioned night drill, and the pulses stopped, and 8 faces of 7 species turned toward the leader of first section, standing in their doorway with his keel pulled flat and the academy's whole century balanced on what he said next. The annex closed its review this afternoon, Telek said. Your reports are dead. Nobody with rank is coming. He took the slate from under his arm, Ren's trace, the archive pulls, 11 smooth transients in 400 hours, the arithmetic of section refit dates done in his own hand, evidence wearing an Aruvith's name now, for whatever that was worth against a closed door, and he held it out to her across the cold hangar air. Show me how you see it coming. The skip. You move before it finishes. I have watched the frames 40 times and I cannot find what your eyes find. She looked at the slate, then at him, and her cast-offs looked at her, and the wind came in under the doors. You testified my hands caused it, she said. There was no heat in it. It was a fact being placed on the bench between them, the way Hav had placed the coupler core, an instrument to be examined. Yes, Telek said, and the Academy believed me, because I am the Academy's best argument for itself. That is exactly what my word is worth, and exactly why you need it. You have the data and the eyes and the lowest score on the wall. I have the rank and a closed door and a man upstairs who thinks I see cables. He set the slate on the workbench. His keel ached, flat against his ribs, the old scar line burning with what he was about to spend. I cannot reopen your reports, Roan, but there are 16 hulls flying the throat at dusk in 6 weeks, all of them on aural couplers, and I lead half of them, and you lead the other half, and the canyon will not care whose name is on the folio when the shift change hits the lattice. Mid-figure. Teach me to see the wind. Teach my section. If the Academy will not read the documentation and hear the words found a shape he had not planned, and he let them, then we will be the documentation. For the first time since the morning the simulator ate itself, the human's face changed. Nothing dramatic. The weather lines at her eyes deepened a fraction, and she pulled a length of red signal cloth from her pocket. Confiscated cloth. He was nearly sure, recovered from some proctor's bin out of pure stubbornness, and tied it to the thruster bench's test yoke with 2 quick turns of her wrist. Lesson 1, she said. Stop trusting your body. It's a committee. The lessons happened at night, in the bilge hangar, and then in the air above the dark sheer under training waivers. Telek signed himself, and they were the hardest thing he had done since he was 6 years old, because she had named the problem in the first minute, and the problem did not go away by being named. His body was a committee. Every gust that touched his hull was poled, averaged, smoothed, and served to him as a feeling, and the feeling was beautiful, and the feeling was a consensus, and the consensus arrived late. To fly eyes out, he had to do the one thing the shorn child had spent a lifetime promising never to do again: overrule the committee. Look at the raw wind, trust the cable. The first night he could not do it at all. She set him hovering in ground effect with a single ribbon tied to a mast ahead of his hull, and asked him to call the gusts before his keel felt them. Just call them, left or right, off the ribbon's flick. And his eyes saw the flicks, and his mouth refused the words, because his keel said steady, and 6 years of canon said the keel outranks the eye, and 20 years before that a shoal full of adults had said it too, said it with 30 keels going silent at once. He sat in the hover sweating like a cadet on his first solo. 40 minutes. She did not mock him and she did not soften it. She sat on the hangar roof in the cold with a signal lamp and waited, and when he finally croaked, left a full breath before his keel hummed. She clicked the lamp once, acknowledged, logged, move on, and that small green click did something embarrassing to his chest that no posted score had done in years. Again, she said, so they went again. He learned her grammar the way she had learned the canyons, in increments by attention. The ribbon was only the alphabet. Past it came the dust. She could read a gust 2 gates out by what it did to the grit on a ledge, and past the dust came the plume light, the way another hull's drive exhaust feathered at its edges when the air around it changed its mind, and past the plume came the thing he had no word for, the whole field seeing, her dark eyes never resting on anything and never missing anything. The storm courier's stare that had spent 4 years threading cargo through Earth's southern cyclone lines, where, as she put it, the weather was the curriculum and the tuition was your hull. Couriers fly alone, he said one night on the cold roof, after a run where he had called 9 gusts in 11, and his keel had sulked the entire time. It was as close as he had come to an apology for the corridor, for the banner, for stones and shoals. Couriers fly alone, she agreed. That's the weakness, not the strength. You think I'm here to teach the Academy that alone is better. I'm here because alone tops out. One set of eyes has blind arcs. I can't watch my own 6 in the gate and the plume of a wingmate all at once. Nobody can. Your shoal covers every arc at once and trusts itself completely, and that's the most beautiful flying I've ever seen. And the day its data goes bad, it will glide 30 children into a cable and feel steady the whole way down. She said it evenly, eyes on the dark canyon, and then she heard the shape of what she'd said and looked over at him. That landed somewhere. Where did it land? He had told no one in 20 years. He told her on a hangar roof at 2 bells past midnight in the flat voice flyers used for casualty reports. The harbor, the light on the cable, the consensus that said glide, the braking, the instructor's wing, the children in the nets, the assembly hall, and the 30 keels going silent to him at once, the word shorn, and what the word did to a body built for belonging. She listened the way she watched wind, completely, without flinching and without performance. And when he finished, she was quiet for a while, and then she said the thing that rearranged him. "You've spent 20 years thinking the lesson was don't break," she said. "The lesson was, a shoal with no procedure for one flyer's eyes is broken before it launches. You were 6. You saw the cable and you had no grammar to put it in, nothing but your own body, screaming sideways. That's not a character flaw, Telek. That's a missing page. You didn't fail the canon." She tipped her head back at the academy above them, all its lit windows stacked up the cliff. "The canon failed you, so write the page." They wrote the page. It took 18 nights. It needed a name nobody important would ask questions about, so they called it the Free Leg, as if it were a stretch of open circuit, and it was built from both of their libraries because it could not have come from either alone. The problem was specific: a coupler skip inside a 16-hull paired lattice at speed, in the throat, at shift change. One hull loses drive for 0.03 of a second. The shoal smooths it. Nobody feels it. The stricken hull falls a half-length out of the seam into her wingmate's wake, and at throat spacing the cascade eats the whole lattice in 4 seconds. He had run the model 30 times and it ate the lattice every time, 1,100 years of canon notwithstanding, because every page of the canon assumed the machines told the truth. So, eyes assigned before launch, each flyer owns a watch arc on a wingmate's plume, the way her castoffs had owned arcs up the stack climb. A spoken tell, 2 syllables, hull number, the instant a plume edge went ragged. Not a debate, not a poll, a call with one authorized voice per arc. The way Earth couriers cleared each other through storm cells. And then the maneuver itself, the part that was hers. Don't hold form. Shed it. On the call, the lattice breathes. Every hull steps a half interval outward along pre-assigned lines, opening the seams wide enough that a skipping hull can fall and recover inside its own air, hurting no one, and then the lattice breathes back in and the figure resumes 4 seconds older, intact. Form broken deliberately, by procedure, so that it never has to break by catastrophe. "The shoal won't like it," Telek said, looking at the finished geometry glowing between them. It was true. It was also, he noticed, no longer the most important true thing he could say about anything. "The shoal doesn't have to like it," she said. "It has to drill it until it's boring. Fear you drill into boredom is just procedure with a heartbeat." "Lesson 1 for my section, day 1. She flicked the diagram to his slate. "Your turn, section leader. Teach your 8 to break formation on purpose. I'll teach mine to hold one. We'll meet in the middle of the sky." Teaching first was a war he had to win twice, once against 8 keels and once against the term itself, because the term had not stopped moving while he learned a new grammar in the dark. The flight master, whose instinct for narrative was the sharpest instrument on the cliff, had decreed a centennial trial, a seating exhibition, lead against lead, first spine against the riser's spine, head-to-head down the marked circuit at dusk in front of the whole academy, so the examiner's board may anticipate the pairing. Everyone understood the actual purpose. The wire had spent a half-term building the human into a legend. The flight master intended the legend graded, publicly by the best flyer on the cliff, and the grade entered into the record before the fleet arrived. Telek flew the trial to win, because anything less would have been visible today and fatal to everything they were building at night. And also, he admitted it to himself in the start box, with the honesty the night drills were making chronic, because he wanted to know. The whole academy on the rails, the canyon going copper, the woman in the other box who had rebuilt his eyes, and the oldest question flying has: who's better? The answer was nobody, and the answer was the two of them were no longer playing the same instrument they had been playing at the term. Start, and 4,000 cadets watched both of those answers happen in 11 minutes. He took the first half on pure canon, his gates were geometry, his lines were the book printed on moving air, and she could not match that and did not try. She took the Gus legs back from him with flying that made the rails gasp, riding the shift's shoulder through the lower gates, sideways in that door-flung open attitude, and he watched her do it from a length behind and realized he could read it now, could see the dust tail she was seeing, could call the gust she was about to use before she used it. And in the last corridor, where the day wind and the night wind argued through the rock teeth, Telek soon did something no flyer of his species had ever done on the open wire. He overruled the committee. His keel said damp and hold, and the raw wind said otherwise, and he flew the otherwise, banked into the gust's shoulder eyes out, and let the canyon throw him through the final gate, and he beat her across the line by a quarter length, and the score posted first spine 96, riser spine 94, and the rails came apart in noise. The two numbers were not the story. Anyone literate in flying who watched the replay saw the story. The Academy's perfect classicist had flown the last corridor in the courier's grammar, and the courier had flown the middle gates with a discipline straight off the canon's early pages, and the two styles had not fought each other, they had braided. Ren, watching from the rail with the rest of first section, said afterward that it had looked less like a duel than like a conversation neither of them could have anywhere else. D watched the same replay, alone 4 times. Telek knew because the file's access log was not sealed, and Telek had developed by then a records clerk and a habit. The last board of the season nearly beat her, and the way it nearly beat her told the cliff more about the term than any score had. The 4th section seat holder, a methodical Veld flyer named Amitsaro, had done what no challenger's opponent had bothered to do all term. She had studied the human instead of dismissing her. For 10 days before the circuit, 4th section's training slots were booked at dawn and dusk, and cadets who passed the yard reported the strangest sight of the season, Amitsaro hovering behind a mast with a strip of unauthorized cloth on, it teaching herself to read a ribbon, grimly, badly better every morning. She flew the challenge circuit with both grammars half-fused. Cannon discipline through the geometry gates, and in the gust legs, crude but real, a wind reader's anticipation, leaning into shifts a full beat before her instruments confirmed them. For 9 gates she held the human dead even, and the rails, which had come to watch an execution, found themselves watching a contest. Asha took the seat back in the 10th gate by doing the thing that could not be studied from a distance. She stopped reading the canyon and started reading her opponent. Sorrow's hull carried no ribbon, the manifest applied to boards, so the human read the hull itself, the micro-shiver of its control surfaces, the plume feathering at its edges, the way Sorrow's whole machine telegraphed its next correction, the way a sparring partner telegraphs a strike, and she positioned herself 2 moves ahead of a flyer who was only 1 move ahead of the wind. She crossed the line a half length up, and before the wire had even posted the seat change, she had pulled alongside Sorrow's hull in the cool-down lane and said, on an open training channel, audible to the rails, 9 clean gates off 10 days practice. Come find me when the term ends. That pace deserves a real teacher. Amitsaro filed for instruction at the bilge hangar the next morning, seat lost, pride apparently intact, and the cliff absorbed the real lesson of the board. The method was no longer hers. It was loose in the academy now, learnable, spreading section by section through dawn slots and unauthorized masts, and the institution could fight a foreigner forever, but it had never once in 100 years managed to fight a result. Boards closed the week after with no seat above her left to take that anyone would risk. Her final run count topped the reserves list by a margin that ended the argument, and the provost posted the centennial pairing on the wall, Roan A, lead, risers 8. Behind her, confirmed seat by seat, the bilge-made flesh, Estovi the stunted keel fledgling gate reader, Karsh the bracket, anchor. The Marassi twins, who had drilled their panic into boredom and not panicked once since the second ascent. 3 more of the wings reclaimed spare parts. The cast-off section flying the Academy's 100th year beside first, exactly as the wire had predicted, and the refectory hung no banners about it, because the Academy had run out of jokes it was sure of. Ren found out about the night drills the way seconds always find out, by being better at his lead's patterns than his lead was. He presented himself at the bilge hangar at 1 bell past midnight, having followed Telek down the cliff stairs at a professional distance, and stood in the doorway taking inventory, the leader of first section in a sweat-dark flight skin, hovering blind-keeled behind a ribbon mast, the human on the roof with a signal lamp, the geometry of a formation-breaking figure glowing on the planning table where any proctor could walk in and read it. And Telek watched his second's keel run the full grammar of a Ruvith alarm, and braced for the sentence that would end everything. I am obligated to report this. 11 transients in 400 hours, Ren said instead, slowly, like a flyer reading a trace. We refit 6 days before the descent rehearsal cycle. The whole wing flies the throat at dusk on those couplers, at centennial spacing, in front of the fleet. His eyes went from the diagram to his lead, and his keel settled, and Ren Ovasi, narrator, purist, the second finest classicist on the cliff, asked the question that told Telek he had not lost his section but doubled it. Why was I not the first flyer you taught? First section came down the cliff stairs 2 nights later, all 8, in civilian skins, and the bilge hangar got crowded, and the thing that happened in it across the next 3 weeks had no name in the Academy's records because no record was ever made. 2 lattices, 16 flyers, 7 species, and 1 human, drilling a page of canon that did not exist. The watch arcs, the 2-syllable tells, the breathing lattice, shed and recover, first on foot with lamps in the cold hangar like children learning a dance, then in the air over the dark sheer in configurations that would have cost every one of them their seats if a single proctor had pulled the traffic. Logs. Telek flew wing on the human and called her plume. She flew wing on Ren and called his. Estovi, it turned out, could read a ragged plume edge faster than anyone of any species, his broken keel having left his eyes alone his whole life to compensate, And when first section's flyers began deferring to the bilge fledglings' calls without irony, Telek understood that whatever else the term had built, the Academy's ladder had quietly stopped describing anything real about the 16 of them at all. The shoal did not like breaking form. The shoal learned. Fear drilled into boredom is procedure with a heartbeat, and by the third week the free leg was boring, and the 16 of them were something the canon had no word for either. Not a shoal, not a courier line. Both grammars in one sky, each covering the other's blind arc. 6 days before the centennial, Telek took the whole file, the traces, the refit arithmetic, Javi's bench finding signed at last beside his own name, the free leg geometry annotated as a proposed emergency procedure, and filed it formally with the office of the wing provost as an advisory from the lead of first section regarding flight safety at the centennial long descent. It was the correct procedure. It was the page, written, signed, submitted in clean lines. He filed it at morning bell. By evening bell it was gone, returned unread under the flight master's seal marked closed ref. Engineering review concluded with a single line in Day's own hand beneath the stamp, and the line was not administrative. The line said, "I buried better flyers than you for breaking cleaner pages than this." The endorsement letter went to the examiner's board the same evening, and the records clerk, who had owed Telek favors, sent him one last message before prudently retiring from the favor business, and the message read, he wrote it this afternoon. The word he used was unsteady. Unsteady. 20 years of perfect lines, 6 years of first section, the finest lattice lead the Academy had produced, and one old man with a folio to protect had reached into the file where the cables lived and chosen, with surgical kindness, the one word that meant, "I know what you are. I knew all along." Telek read the message 3 times on the cold landing outside his quarters. Then he did the arithmetic he had been refusing all term. Commission against Canyon, endorsement against 16 hulls, his name against the page, and found with a calm that surprised him like warm current that the numbers had stopped being close. The dress rehearsal, 3 days out, settled whatever arithmetic was left. EI ordered it flown by the book. Full descent, both lattices, cannon spacing, no deviations. The flight master himself in the observation hull, trailing the formation with a proctor crew, and every telemetry channel open. A loyalty parade. Wren called it, and he was not wrong. The old flyer wanted 16 clean hulls on the record before the fleet arrived. Proof entered in advance that the Academy century needed no foreign pages. The wind half-cooperated. The shift change came late and weak. The throat was almost gentle, and 15 of the 16 hulls flew the whole circuit without their couplers missing a breath. The 16th was S. Tovey's, and the skip took him in the upper gates, in easy air, 2 full minutes before the throat, the fault announcing, for anyone willing to hear it, that it kept no schedule and honored no forecast, 0.03 of a second. The fledgling's hull dropped toward the seam below him, and 16 flyers who had drilled a forbidden page for 3 weeks did not fly the page, because the page was banned and the flight master's lenses were live, and what they did instead was almost worse to watch. Every hull near Tovey breathed a quarter interval wider without a single call being spoken. Not the free leg, just its shadow. Instinct trained past hiding, the lattice flexing the way a sleeping body flinches. Tovey's coupler caught. He rose back into station. The formation closed. On the score feed it registered as a spacing wobble, 2 points docked, nothing. In the debrief hall, Dye ran the wobble back 4 times on the big projection. Frame by frame, 16 hulls flexing around a transient, his telemetry, had sampled straight through, and the silence in the room had teeth in it. He knew. Telek watched him know. Watched the old eyes read the shadow of the page in the formation's reflex. Watched the crest go perfectly, deliberately still, and the flightmaster reached the fork that the whole term had been narrowing toward and chose, one last time, the institution. Spafing discipline in the upper gates was disgraceful, Day said flatly, and docked first section a training mark, and certified the rehearsal clean for the examiner's packet, and dismissed the hall. Wren caught Telek's eye across the room as the leads filed out, and his second's keel said it plainly, no words required. He is going to fly 4,000 cadets worth of reputation into the throat at shift. Change to keep from being wrong. Then we keep being ready to be right, Telek said quietly, on the stairs, until the canyon votes. The night before the centennial, he carried a bundle of red signal cloth up the cliff stairs to first section's hangar and began tying telltales to the Academy's finest hulls with his own hands. Day found them at dawn, because of course he did. The flightmaster had walked the hangars before first bell for 50 years. He came down first section's line in the gray light with 2 proctors behind him and stopped at Telek's hull, where a red ribbon streamed from the nose patot in the morning wind off the sheer, bright as a wound against the gray and bone livery, and the entire section stood to at their hulls, and watched their lead and their flight master regard one another across everything the term had become. "All equipment," he said, on the morning of the Academy's century, in front of the fleet. His crest was perfectly still. "Strip them." "Section leader, that is an order under the flight code," witnessed. "Under the flight code, flight master, I'll require the citation," Telek said, and his voice came out level, which pleased him distantly, like a clean gate in crosswind. "The manifest restricts equipment affixed to control surfaces and linkages. A pitot streamer is neither. The code we both memorized as fledglings classifies marker cloth under ceremonial colors at the discretion of the section lead for formal flights." He paused, and the pause was not kind, and he had earned it and let himself have it. "The Centennial is a formal flight. We are flying the Academy's colors, all 16 of us." Behind A, down the line, every hull of first section carried the red. Beyond the hangar mouth on the lower aprons where the risers 8 were already at pre-flight, 16 more ribbons snapped in the wind. The proctors looked at the streamers and at the code slate one of them had hastily pulled, and at the flight master, and found nothing to write. D stepped close. The old Aruvith's voice dropped to a register meant for one keel only. "I know what she's taught you to see," he said. "Understand me. Soon, I am not blind and I have never been blind. I am responsible. 4,000 cadets fly hulls I certify on couplers I procured, by a book I have spent a life defending, and if that book is wrong I will be the one who buried children with it, so it cannot be wrong. Do you understand the arithmetic of my whole age requires it not to be wrong?" For one breath the crest sagged, and Telek saw all 70 years of him, the watchroom solitude, the 4 wingmates in the canyon, the folio signed in good faith going bad in slow motion. Then the institution closed back over the man like water. "Fly your colors. The examiners will see a tidy superstition, the couplers will hold as they have held all term, and at end of term you will answer for every line of this, all of it. That is a promise from the last flyer on this cliff who still keeps them." "They'll hold until the throat," Telek said quietly. "At shift change, under paired lattice load. You've read the file, flight master, you sealed it, which required reading it. If we're both fortunate, tonight proves me unsteady." He came to attention correctly, completely, and gave D the salute owed the rank and the years and the dead wingmates, all of it, without irony. "And if we're not both fortunate, the page exists. Either way, the Academy keeps flying. That's the whole of my treason, sir. It was never anything else." The flight master looked at him a long moment, and something moved behind the old eyes that Telek could not read. It would take him until the canyon floor that night to learn its name, and then Day turned and walked up the line and out of the hangar, and the Centennial came on with the day. The fleet examiners arrived at midday, 5 officers in the deep blue of the survey arm, dustless, ceremonial, trailing adjutants. The Academy polished itself around them. The ladder wall ran the century's honor roll on a loop. The refectory served the founder's meal. The wire carried greetings from sister academies on 4 worlds, and beneath all of it, 16 flyers moved through their pre-flight rites with the particular calm of people who have drilled a fear into boredom and intend to keep it there. Telek found Asha on the lower apron an hour before launch at her hull, re-knotting the wrist ribbon. The original, the frayed one, the one that had ridden a dying simulator down on the term's first morning. The evening light was starting to copper the canyon rim. Below them the sheer breathed its long day breath, gates strung down it like beads, and on the cliff above, 4,000 cadets were filling the rails and terraces, and the open wire's lenses were live to every screen on Sarad and to the examiner's booth, and by Centennial custom to the FleetNet itself. "Forecast," he said. "Shift change is coming early and hard. There's a pressure step behind the west rim. See the dust standing off the third tooth? The canyon's going to argue with itself right about the time we're threading the throat." She said it the way she said everything about wind, as fact wearing no costume, and then she looked up at him, and the weather lines deepened, not quite a smile. "You asked that like a wingmate, you know, not like a rival. I am informed couriers fly alone," Telek said, "so I am unfamiliar with the distinction. Funny species, the Aruvith. A whole term to make one joke." She pulled the knot tight, flexed her hand, and was serious again between one breath and the next. "Telek, whatever the couplers do tonight, your 8 will hold, because you rebuilt them, against your own anatomy in a cold hangar at night, with everything to lose. I watched you do it." She held out her hand, Earth fashion. "It's been an honor being your problem, section leader." He took the hand. His people sealed packs keel to keel, in shared current, and his keel was sealed inside a flight skin, and hers had never existed, and the grip her small, warm, calloused hand carried, somehow the same signal down his lateral lines, which was a thing he decided not to examine until he was old. "Watch arcs at the throat," he said. "Tovi calls my pair, I call yours." "I know the page," she said. "I helped write it." They launched at the dusk bell, 16 hulls off the high aprons into copper light. And for 20 minutes, the centennial-long descent was the most beautiful thing the Academy had put on the open wire in 100 years. The descent opened from altitude, the paired lattices forming above the comb's crown where the air was cold glass. First section in the lead diamond. The risers 8 interleave behind and below, 16 drives feathering in the long light, every ribbon streaming true. They flew the crown first, the centennial figure, both lattices wheeling about a common axis like a single instrument, and the rails on the cliff went quiet in the way that is louder than noise. Telek flew the spine of it with his keel wide open and the shoal humming warm down his lines. 8 keels, 1 wind, the old beautiful average, and laid over it, like a second sight he no longer had to choose between the eyes. Tovi's hull steady at his flank, the human's plume feathering clean 2 seams below, dust standing off the 3rd tooth on the west rim, all of it seen, all of it held, both grammars at once. He had been wrong in the corridor all those weeks ago, wrong in the deepest place. This, not the stone, not the solitary wing. This was what a human added to a lattice, not noise. Another whole way of knowing, flown in formation with his own. They came down the canyon in figures 100 years deep. The climb inverted into its descending mirror, the come threaded through the upper gates at speed. The braid and the wire's lenses caught what the braid had become, with the risers flying half of it, the strict old weave breathing now, expanding and contracting through the crosswind gates. Classicism and courier grammar braided so tightly that the examiner's adjutants stopped annotating and simply watched. On the cliff, 4,000 cadets watched a bilge fledgling with a stunted keel hold the gate line of the Academy's 100th year. Dead center, perfect. And the score feed beside the honor roll climbed and kept climbing, 90, 93, 95, the highest paired lattice numbers ever posted on the wall. And in the examiner's booth, the senior officer of the survey arm leaned to the wing provost and asked a question nobody on Sarod had thought to ask. In a century, why do your hulls fly flagged? And Seleth Andra, who had read a sealed advisory more carefully than her flight master knew, answered, discretion of the leads, examiner. The Academy's colors. Watch them. Then the lattices dropped toward the throat, where the canyon narrowed between its great rockin' teeth, and the gates ran 2 abreast through the dark coming up off the floor, and the day wind and the night wind met them there, early, exactly as the dust had promised, and the canyon began to argue with itself. And inside the argument, under full paired lattice load, in the shear, in the firmware where 2 corrections collide, the aural couplers began to... The first skip took the 4-seat of first section, a flyer named Asen Vialtar, 2 gates into the throat. Telek's keel felt nothing. The shoal hummed steady, 8 keels poling, the consensus warm and certain and wrong, and against that warmth came a voice. 2 syllables. Hull number, flat as a hammer on a bench, S. Tovi, calling his watch arc the way 16 flyers had drilled it in a cold hangar until it bored them. 4 ragged, and the lattice breathed. No debate, no poll. 16 hulls stepped a half interval outward along lines assigned 3 weeks ago, the seams opening like a hand unclenching, and inside his own suddenly generous envelope of air, Asen Vialtar's drive let go for 0.03 of a second, dropped him half a length with a lurch that would have put him into Ren's wake at throat spacing, and meant nothing. Empty air bought in advance, his coupler caught, his hands corrected. He rose back into a seam that had waited for him, and the lattice breathed in, and the figure resumed, 4 seconds older, intact, descending. On the cliff, 4,000 cadets saw the Academy's paired centennial lattice flex like a living thing through gate after gate, and most of them thought it was choreography. In the examiner's booth, 5 officers of the survey arm, who had spent careers reading formation telemetry, sat slowly forward in their seats. They had just watched a 16-hull lattice absorb an uncommanded drive transient at speed, in a canyon, in sheer, with a procedure that existed in no manual of any fleet, and the telemetry was printing on their slates in real time, and the transient had a signature, and the signature was nobody's hands. Again, the senior examiner said quietly to no one, "It'll do it again. Watch the starboard plumes." It did it again. Twice in the next minute, as the shift change wind dug into the throat, and the load harmonics found the flaw over and over. A riser hull, then the 2-seat of first, each skip called off a ragged plume by its assigned watcher, each call answered by the breath, the shed, the catch, the recovery. The wire's lenses caught all of it. The score feed, that pitiless instrument, had stopped meaning anything. The suite docked them for every broken interval, the numbers sliding down the wall, 95, 91, 86. And for the first time in the Academy's 100 years, nobody on the cliff was looking at the score. They were looking at the red ribbons and the opening seams, at flyers calling wind to each other across species lines, at a thing that had no page in the canon and was visibly, repeatedly, keeping the canon's children alive, and the part of the Academy old enough to Reed Flying was beginning to understand, with a cold crawling up its collective spine, that none of this was choreography, and that someone had known. In the watchroom at the top of the cliff, Flight Master Orvin Day stood alone at the window with a slate in his hand, watching his couplers fail in formation, 11 transients in 400 hours becoming 4 transients in 4 minutes on the open wire, and what he did in that room in those minutes, the Academy learned it afterward from the duty log, was this. He authenticated his command codes, opened the wing-wide net, and began, in a steady voice, grounding every oral refit hull on Sarad that was not currently airborne. The argument of his whole age collapsing, and the old flyer answering it the only way he had left, with procedure, with clean lines, with the book. Then he said on the open net, where every cadet and every examiner and the entire fleet feed could hear it, Centennial Flight, Sarad Control. Flight Master to lead pair. The canyon is yours, section leader soon. Bring them down whole. All stations, the advisory of first section, sealed reference 994, is in force as of this transmission by my order and over my signature. In force, Telek thought, threading gate 11 with the wind hammering the rock teeth. Sealed reference 994. He acknowledged the unsteady lead in his name with 2 clicks because he had no spare breath for history, and the throat took everything else he had. Because the page held for transients and what came at gate 13 was not a transient. Ren's coupler had skipped once in training and once at gate 9, and firmware that fails under colliding corrections fails worst in the hull that has failed before. The third skip arrived as the night wind threw its full shoulder through the gap between the teeth, and Ren's starboard drive let go and did not catch. Half a heartbeat, a full heartbeat, the hull yawing out of the open seam, trailing a plume gone wild at the edges, and Telek heard his second's voice, level, narrating to the last, the finest classicist on the cliff reporting his own fall like a training observation. 2 is hard down, starboard seized, I have no lateral, and the canyon floor was 900 meters below and rising. And every flyer in 2 lattices knew the page for this because she had made them. Drill the page for this, and the page said, the catch is flown by whoever has the angle, and nobody votes. The human had the angle. Asheron came out of the riser's lattice through a seam that breathed open for her before she called it, Tovi calling it for her, the arcs holding even now, and dropped onto Ren's crippled hull out of the copper dark like she had been falling toward this moment all term. What she did next entered the Academy's permanent curriculum under a name nobody ever managed to make formal, because every flyer who saw it live simply called it the catch, and everyone knew which one you meant. She slid her hull under Ren's stricken side into the crushed air between his dead drive and the canyon wall, into wake no cannon page permitted any. Flyer to enter, and she flew her own drive plume against his seized quarter like a hand under an elbow, wing-riding him, lending him her lateral the way one courier braces another through a cell wall, reading his tumble by the ribbon on his patat and her own impossible eyes, 2 hulls flying as 3/4 of a machine. The wire's lenses held them in close frame the whole way down. The gray-and-bone hull of the Academy's second finest flyer, dead-sided, riding the air pressed up by a foreigner with the lowest score in the history of the wall, down through the last 3 gates of the throat. Because she took him through the gates, there was sky enough to flee wide, and she took him through the gates. Later she would shrug on the record and say the gates were the surveyed line. I knew what the wind did there, everywhere else was guessing, down, easing, flaring together, to the long stone shelf called the saddle that stood out from the canyon wall at the throat's mouth. They hit hard. Not gently, the feed showed the skid, the grinding quarter turn, Ren's hull shedding its port skid fairing in a shriek of bright fragments, her hull bucking in the pressure wave and slamming down beside his close enough to share paint. Then dust drifting through the pylon light. Then stillness. Then 2 canopies opening, and 2 figures climbing out under their own power onto the saddle, 900 meters above the canyon floor, and on the open wire, watched by 4,000 cadets and 5 examiners and the fleet net and 1 old flyer alone in a watchroom. Ren Ovasi of first section stood up out of his wrecked hull, crossed the stone to the human, and did a thing Aruvith do not do for other species, because for other species it is only a gesture, and between Aruvith it is the body's own word for shawlmate. He spread his keel to her, fully lateral lines open to the wind, the grammar of belonging offered to a being with no organ to answer it. She answered it anyway. The whole Academy saw the answer. The human looked at the spread keel of the flyer whose section leader's testimony had built the wall around her name, and she untied the frayed red ribbon from her wrist, the original, the one that had ridden the dying simulator on the term's first morning, and knotted it with 2 quick turns around the leading edge of his keel, where every Aruvith on Sarad would know exactly what it had cost and exactly what it meant. Above them, Telek brought the rest of it home. 14 hulls, the throat behind them, the canyon floor opening wide and dark below, and he led the merged lattice down the last kilometers of the long descent, with his keel singing the shoal's warm wrong certainty, and his eyes doing the real work, gate by gate, breath by breath, the way she had taught him on a hangar roof at 2 bells past midnight. They crossed the sentry gate at the canyon floor in formation, every ribbon streaming, and the score feed posted its final number, and the number was 71, the lowest centennial score ever recorded, and the Hall of Wakes above them erupted in the loudest sound the Academy had made. In 100 years, 4,000 cadets on their feet for a 71, roaring, because every literate flyer on that cliff had just watched the difference between a score and a truth, and knew at last in public all at once which one the wall had been showing them all term. Telek sat in his cooling hull on the canyon floor with his hands still on the yoke, and listened to the roar come down the cliff like weather, and looked up through his canopy at the saddle high above, where a foreigner and his second stood small against the pylon light beside their wrecked machines, alive, and he found he was shaking, and that his keel had spread itself wide without any order from him, and that he did not care who saw. The inquiry took 9 days, and for once in the history of institutions, the data was never in question, because the data had 4,000 witnesses and 32 lens angles, and the FleetNet's own recording, time-stamped, unimpeachable. 4 uncommanded drive transients and 1 full seizure, all in aural refit couplers, all under paired lattice load and shear, all matching. Line for line, the fault signature documented in 3 dismissed equipment reports filed across a term by Cadet A. Roan, and in 1 sealed advisory filed 6 days before the centennial by the lead of first section, returned unread. And then the duty log was entered into evidence, and the room went very still while it was read, placed in force, mid-flight, over the flight master's own signature, by the flight master himself. The board sat in the assessment chamber at the top of the spine stair, the same pale stone, the same cold light, with the 5 fleet examiners ranged beside the wing provost, and the open wire carrying every word to the academy below, because Seleth Andra had ruled on the first morning that an inquiry born on the open wire would be conducted on it. The academy had watched the failure live. It would watch the accounting live. The wall showed everything. That had always been the charter. The charter was about to be taken at its word all the way up. Have testified for half a day, and the coupler wright's testimony was a slow, methodical demolition. The bench cannot hold a canyon. The firmware collision, reproduced at last, because now the annex had 5 in-flight captures to model from, and with 5 captures the fault that could not be reproduced in an afternoon. 11 transients in 400 hours, logged, dated, mapped against refit schedules in an arithmetic any fledgling could follow, and beside that map the 3 reports of Cadet Roan, read aloud into the record at the senior examiner's insistence, dates first. The first report had been filed 4 hours after the simulator casualty. The room listened to its own institution declining, in writing 3 times, with procedural courtesy, to know something it had been told. The engineering annex's reviewing officer resigned his certification authority before the board could move to strip it, which was understood by everyone as the institution offering a limb to save the body, and the board accepted the limb without comment and kept its eyes on the body. Asha Roan testified for 40 minutes and was the least dramatic witness of the 9 days. She declined every invitation to enlarge. Asked by an adjutant whether she believed species bias had buried her reports, she said, "I believe a -31 buried them. I'd have struggled to read past that number too." That's why scores that grade a machine's failure as a flyer's failure are dangerous, not because they're unkind, because they're load-bearing. Asked what she wanted from the board, she said, "Fix the firmware before anyone else flies it. The rest is bookkeeping." The senior examiner, who had spent 30 years watching witnesses perform for boards, looked at her for a long moment with an expression the wire could not parse, and wrote 1 line on his slate, and the line, entered later into the formal findings, read, "Witness appears to regard vindication as a distraction from flight safety. Recommend the fleet learn her name." Telek soon testified last but one, and did the thing he had rehearsed alone on the cold landing for 9 nights. The thing the canon demanded and his whole body fought. He retracted, formally on the record, in front of the academy whose best argument for itself he was, the testimony he had given in that same chamber at the term's beginning. "I told this board the candidate's recovery was illegible, and that a flyer who cannot be followed is a hazard," he said. Both statements were accurate. Neither was true. Her recovery was illegible to me because my instrument for reading flight, my keel, my training, my cannon smooths over exactly the class of events she was responding to. I graded her against the limits of my own perception and called the result objectivity. The academy then did the same thing at scale. It had 1,100 years of consensus telling it the machines were sound, and one foreign instrument insisting otherwise, and it did what consensus does with an outlier. It rounded her to 0. He looked once at the row where the Academy's senior staff sat. The fault signature was in the telemetry of her first run. I found it myself 20 days into the term in one night, reading raw traces by a method she later taught me freely, knowing at the time that I was the witness who had buried her. The board should weigh that when it apportions blame for what the cliff has been calling a miracle. Very little about the centennial was miraculous. The page that held the lattice together was written in a cold hangar over 18 nights by the two flyers this institution had scored lowest and trusted least. We were never short of evidence. We were short of people willing to be wrong in public. I am no longer one of them. Nobody applauded. It was not a chamber for applause, but the wire carried it whole into the refectory and the section halls and the bilge hangar with the broken repeater, and something in the Academy's posture toward its own wall shifted that afternoon and did not shift back. Orvin Day took the stand on the final morning, and the Academy braced for the institution to defend itself. And instead the old flyer set his slate face down on the rail and spoke without it. He confirmed everything in order. The folio, his signature, the margins he had believed he was buying. The annex review convened at the speed of preemption. The sealed advisory returned unread. It was read. He corrected the record quietly. He returned marked unread and read twice. The board should not allow me the smaller failure. The smaller failure is forgivable. The endorsement letter with the word unsteady in it, which he requested be entered into evidence himself as documentation of suppression over the objection of his own counsel. He did not perform remorse. His crest stayed level. He gave the board the facts of his conduct with the same clean lines he had given the Academy for 50 years, and the testimony was somehow more damning and more bearable for it. Only at the end did he lift his eyes to the gallery, where the cadets of first section and the risers 8 sat in their ranked blocks, and let the institution open enough to show the man. I have heard it said all term that the human flies alone, he said. Cliff, hear your flight master's last finding. The loneliest flyer on Sarad this term was not the human. It was every officer who saw a wrong number and chose the comfort of the average. She, at least, was never alone in the sky for 1 hour. She had her eyes, her dead-honest instrument, and the nerve to read it against 4,000 of us. We had each other, which is how the error survived. A shoal can be a refuge from the truth. I taught half of you that the consensus is how the dead protect the living, and I stand corrected on the open wire. The consensus is how the living protect their sleep. The dead protect you with pages, and pages are written by whichever single flyer saw the cable and refused to glide. He turned to the board and came very slowly to attention. I grounded the fleet refit at gate 11 because a section leader I called unsteady was the only steady instrument on my cliff. The board will have my resignation from flight authority with the morning record. I request assignment to the fault analysis under right half if the Academy will have an old man checking arithmetic at a bench. The arithmetic is where I stopped looking. It seems the honest place to resume. The board's findings ran 19 pages and the Academy read all of them. But the cliff only ever quoted 3 lines, that the oral refit was suspended fleet-wide pending firmware rework, credited to the persistence of a cadet whose evidence survived her score, that the procedures improvised by the paired centennial lattices had demonstrably prevented loss of life and warranted formal adoption, and that the posting of equipment casualty error against a flyer's record was, effective immediately, prohibited on every wall the charter touched, which left the wall itself. They corrected it at evening bell, deliberately, with the whole Academy at mess in the wire live, because Selathandra understood that institutions apologize in the same currency they injure. The ladder wall in the Hall of Wakes went dark for the first time in 100 years. The entire wall, every score, every rung, and then it relit, rung by rung, rebuilt from the charter's route, and when it came to Roan, the -31 was gone. In its place, the wall posted the term's first entry as the inquiry had regraded it. Challenge run, equipment casualty. Recovery executed beyond curriculum. Score void, cause vindicated, and beneath it, in the small honor script, the wall reserved for century events, a line the provost had written herself and would never admit to. The wall shows everything. It does not yet see everything. Year 100. 4,000 cadets in the refectory watched the lowest number in the Academy's history come off the wall, and there was no roar this time. There was something better. There was a long settling quiet, the sound of a 100-year-old institution exhaling, and then the ordinary clatter of mess resuming, as if the truth had always been there, as if it were nothing at all, which Telek thought, watching from the doorway, was exactly how you could tell it had gone all the way in. Spectacle is how a place reacts to the exceptional. Quiet is how it absorbs a correction into what it simply knows. He found her afterward on the observation shelf above the empty hall, looking down at the rillet wall with her arms folded on the rail, and he stood beside her, and for a while neither of them improved on the silence. "They'll write the page in this term's hand," she said finally. "Then in 10 years some examiner will teach it like it came down with the founders, and nobody will remember it was ever a fight." That's the good ending, you know. Pages that remember being fights stay controversial. Pages that forget become canon. You sound like you're leaving before the applause. Surveys leave when the weather's mapped. But she didn't move, and the canyon breathed below them, and the new entry glowed small and final on the wall. "Commissioning's in 6 days. The examiners asked about you. The lattice posting, you'll take it?" "That depends," Telek said. "On the answer to a question I am required to ask in public," and he would not explain himself further, because a whole term among humans had taught him, against every instinct of a consensus species, the tactical value of being briefly illegible. The Canon Council convened 2 days later in the chart room above the spine stair, and for the first time in the Academy's 100 years, a cadet was summoned to it as an author rather than a defendant. 2 cadets. The council was 9 senior instructors, the provost and the open codex itself, the master canon, the physical book, 1,100 flyers worth of margins and amendments, carried up from its vault under guard like the relic it was, and the business of the session was a single new page. They argued the geometry for 6 hours, which Telek had expected, and the arguing made the page better, which he had also expected. The council's pedants found 2 seam spacing cases he and Asha had never drilled, and an instructor who had flown rescue circuits for 30 years tightened the watch arc handoff until it had no slack left in it anywhere. What he had not expected was the fight over the name. The drafting clerk, following form, had headed the page "The Roan Soon Recovery," and Asha Roan looked at the heading the way she had once looked at a banner in the refectory, and asked for the floor, and killed the name in 90 seconds. "Name it after us and you date it," she said. "You make it a story about 2 cadets, and stories about people invite arguments about people. Whether we were right, whether we were lucky, whether your own flyer was compromised by the foreigner. Strip the names. Let the page say what the wind says. 50 years from now, nobody should feel anything when they drill this. It should be as boring as a pre-flight strap check. Boring is what saved 16 hulls in the throat, not us." The council, being a council, debated for another hour what she had settled in 90 seconds, and then the Master Codex gained its newest entry under the plainest heading in the whole book, page 9 of Descents, the open seam. Watch arcs assigned before launch. 1 authorized voice per arc, 2 syllables, hull and condition. On the call, the lattice breathes, shed by a sign line, recover, resume, form broken by procedure so that it never breaks by catastrophe. At the bottom, where every page of the canon carried its lineage, the clerk entered the only attribution she would accept, and the only one Telek wanted. Paid for in the throat, year 100. Drilled in the bilge hanger first. The telltales went into the equipment manifest the same session, pitot streamers, red, all hulls, all flights, listed forever after in the Academy's dry inventory voice as centennial colors, standard issue, and if any instructor in the room understood that the cliff had just made a confiscate strip of courier cloth into permanent regulation, nobody was indiscreet enough to smile about it where the codex could see. Reno Vassi came off the medical roster the same week, his shoulder rebuilt, his narrating intact. He had described his own fracture assessment to the bone setters in such detail that they had threatened sedation, and his first act on flight status was to walk down the cliff stairs to the bilge hanger and request, formally with his keel held at respectful half-spread, instruction in eyes-out reading from Cadet S. Tovey of the Risers 8. The wing's second finest classicist, schooling under a stunted keel, fledgling 3 shoals had returned like defective cargo. He took the instruction seriously, and the fledgling gave it seriously. And within days there were 9 more cadets standing in the cold at the ribbon, massed, then 20, then a waiting roster, and the red ribbon Asha had knotted to Ren's keel on the saddle stayed where she had tied it, through medical, through the inquiry, through commissioning, until the cloth frayed white at the edges. And when other Aruvith on the cliff began wearing a thread of red at the keel's leading edge, not as equipment but as a word in their body's own grammar, the Academy's linguists could have written a paper on what the word meant. Nobody needed the paper. Everyone on the cliff could read it. "I fly with what I cannot feel. Watch my blind arc and I will watch yours." Telek found a D in the refit bays on the eve of commissioning, at Hava's bench, exactly where the old flyer had asked to be put. Crest dull silver under the work lights, sleeves bound back like a fledgling apprentice, checking coupler arithmetic line by line while Hav swore amiably at a test rig. The reworked firmware had passed its 400th consecutive load cycle that afternoon. The fleet's engineers were calling the fault analysis from Sarad the cleanest failure documentation in the survey arm's records. Most of its pages were in D's hand, section leader. D did not look up from the trace. Come to inspect the bench. Come to ask a question before tomorrow puts it out of reach. Telek stood at the end of the bench where the stripped oral core still sat, kept deliberately the way some flyers kept a fragment of the hull that almost killed them. At Gate 11, you had the whole net and 50 years of authority. You could have ordered the flight aborted, climbed us out of the throat, scattered the lattice wide, buried the question for another term. Grounding the refit conceded everything. Why concede at Gate 11 and not at my advisory 6 days earlier in the quiet, where it would have cost you so much less? The older Ruvith set down the trace and was silent for a moment, and when he answered like a flyer reporting weather. Because at your advisory I still believe the page protected the Academy, D said. At Gate 11, I watched the Academy protect itself with a page I had refused to read. 16 children breathing a lattice open around a failure had certified out of existence, and I understood that the only thing left under my authority was the size of the lie. I was never brave, soon. I was orderly. At Gate 11, the order and the truth finally pointed the same direction, and I flew the heading like any coward with a compass. He picked the trace back up. The crest did not move. The interview was ending as it had been conducted, in clean lines. You were braver 6 days sooner, and the human was braver by a full term. The margin between the three of us is the only thing I would have you remember from my whole tenure. Bravery is mostly a question of how early. Dismiss, section leader. Some of us have arithmetic. Commissioning came at midday under a hard blue sky. The whole Academy ranked on the high terraces with the canyon at its back, and the fleet examiner's shuttle gleaming on the apron and the open wire, carrying the century's last ceremony to 4 worlds. The roll was long. The cliff cheered itself hoarse by increments. For Reno Vassi, fleet lattice, second seat, his keel wearing its frayed white-edged red where every camera could find it. For Karsh the Bracked, heavy escort command track, the first of his bloodline ever commissioned off Sarad. For the Marassi twins, paired survey postings, panic long since drilled into a fine professional wariness. For S. Tovey, and here the bilge hanger's whole gallery came up roaring, flight. Instructor's aid, gate read curriculum, retained by the Academy that had nearly thrown him away, the stunted keel now listed on his certification, in the inventory's dry voice as non-limiting. Then the senior examiner reached the honor graduate, and the terraces quieted, because everyone knew the tradition and everyone had been waiting for it. The first ask, the Academy's oldest commissioning rite, older than the ladder wall, the question put publicly to the term's finest flyer, the answer entered permanently in the codex beside the year. Name the flyer you would take first into a fleet lattice, and answer for it with your career. 100 years of answers filled that page of the codex, and every one of them was a name from the top of the ladder. And Telek soon stood in front of 4,000 witnesses and the fleet net and the entire arithmetic of his rebuilt life, and found that the answer weighed nothing at all. It had stopped weighing anything in a cold hangar months ago. Today was only the posting of a score already flown. Asha Roan, he said, and I will answer for it with more than a career. Put it in the codex with its reasons. She is the finest wind reader on this cliff, or any cliff I expect to see. She rebuilt 8 flyers this Academy discarded and then rebuilt the one it ranked highest. And a year ago, I stood in a corridor below this terrace and told the wire that humans cannot hold lattice. He let the sentence stand in the air, unsoftened. His own banner hung back up so everyone could watch him take it down. I am the leader of first section, and I have never in my life been more completely wrong about anything that flies. Humans do not merely hold lattice. Flown honestly beside them, they widen what a lattice is. The codex may enter that as a finding. It has been tested at full load. The terraces did not erupt. The moment was too square-shouldered for that. What moved across 4,000 cadets instead was the same long-settling exhale that had met the corrected wall, an institution absorbing a truth into what it simply knows, and into that quiet the senior examiner, consulting his slate with the studied blandness of a man enjoying himself, observed that the fleet had anticipated the answer. There was a survey lattice standing up for the deep frontier, charter crews, mixed species, hard weather guaranteed. Command had been drafted for section leader soon. The lead pair seat beside him had been drafted by name for Cadet Roan, contingent on her acceptance and on one condition the fleet wished entered formally. Name the condition, Asha said from the front rank. That the lattice trains in both grammars, the examiner said. The fleet read the throat telemetry very closely, Cadet. We are not interested in flyers who feel everything or flyers who see everything. We are interested in crews who have both and a procedure for disagreeing. Apparently that has to be drilled in a cold hangar by someone with no respect for the manifest. The fleet is prepared to issue the cloth. Then the fleet gets its lattice, she said, and the cliff finally let itself roar. They flew the sheer together one last time the next morning, before the shuttle lifted. Not on any roster, not for any score. 2 hulls off the high apron at first light, with the canyon breathing its slow dawn. Breath and nobody watching but the rock and one early shift proctor who knew better than to log it. They flew the climb because it was there and the thermal was kind. They flew the braid two-handed, trading the lead gate by gate, his geometry and her weather in one seam. And at the bottom, by unspoken agreement, they flew the throat. Clean and slow, no shift change. The morning air through the rock teeth, as honest as air ever got, and passed over the saddle where 2 long skid scars still marked the stone, and neither of them said anything about it, because some pages do not need reading aloud. On the apron afterward, with the shuttle's drives spooling and his section waiting, and the whole rebuilt arithmetic of his life packed into a fleet-issue kit bag, Telek soon did a thing he had decided about in the air. He took from his sleeve a strip of red signal cloth, new, uncut, drawn from stores that morning under the line item Centennial colors, and held it out to her, and when she raised an eyebrow, he shook his head. Not for her wrist. Tie it, he said. You're not. I have watched you do it 100 times, and I want the original specification, not my copy. It goes on the command yoke of a fleet lattice this afternoon, and it stays there as long as I fly, and when some examiner asks me why the survey arm's newest command hull is rigged like a courier's storm runner, I intend to give the full answer at length until they regret asking. She laughed. The first time the whole term he had heard it, bright and short, gone in a second like a gust off the rim, and tied the telltale to his wrist for the walk to the shuttle, 2 quick turns, the courier's knot, snug against the pulse. Lesson last, she said. It's not equipment, Telek. It never was. It's a promise to keep looking. Behind them, up the cliff, the academy was already moving into its 101st year. New cadets spilling from the intake shuttles into the Hall of Wakes. Necks craned at the ladder wall, where the honor script still read, "The wall shows everything. It does not yet see everything." The boards filing their first challenges, first section under a new lead, walking out to morning circuit with red streaming from every plateau. And at the foot of the cliff, in a hangar that no longer deserved the name Bilge, the repeater screen glowed fixed and bright for the first time in 3 terms. Tovey had repaired it himself. His first act as staff, with a strip of frayed cloth knotted to its frame, so that every cast off the ladder sent down the stairs from now on would meet the score and the ribbon in the same glance, the number that showed everything, and the small red promise to keep looking, and could begin, on their first cold morning, learning the difference. The shuttle climbed out over the sheer, and Telek watched the canyon fall away with the telltale stirring at his wrist in the cabin's air, and his keel hummed its old warm averages, and his eyes stayed open, and for the first time since a gray morning over a harbor on Oran Vass, the 2 of them, the committee and the witness, the shoal and the one who saw the cable, felt like a lattice instead of a war. 16 hulls had come down the throat hole. The page was in the codex. The wall had learned to doubt itself, which is the only way any instrument stays honest, and somewhere below, on a stone shelf 900 meters above the canyon floor, the skid scars were already fading into the weather of the cliff, into the long, patient record of every flyer the wind had tested and the page had carried home. He flew with her for 11 years on the deep frontier, and the fleet's records of those crews fill their own shelf, but the Academy's codex keeps the accounting that matters on a single line, entered at year 100 in the drafting clerk's plain hand, and any cadet who climbs the spine stair can read it. The term the ladder was wrong, the bilge wrote the page, and the best flyer on the cliff learned to see.